A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said, "What do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost." Well, happy feast day where we celebrate Edward Pusey, who is a major figure in our Anglican heritage, a 19th century priest, theologian, lecturer at Oxford University. I really do mean Oxford this time. If you saw my Crummell video, you know what I'm talking about. But he was not only at Oxford, but he was one of the seminal figures in the what's known as the Oxford movement. And that has been a movement late 19th century or all throughout the 19th century, essentially, where the theologians, liturgical theologians, scholars who are affiliated with our tradition wound up doing a lot to reclaim the sacramentalist vision and the more Catholic end of our tradition. If you've come through the church and gone to an Episcopal 101 type of class, you'll know that in the Episcopal Church, it's really hard to say exactly what we are because we embody both the Protestant, the insights of the Protestant Reformation and the continuity with the Catholic tradition. And so most of us find ourselves somewhere along on that spectrum, and none other than Queen Elizabeth I, the Elizabethan settlement, said basically, we're not going to try to sort this out, Protestant or Catholic. We're going to let that be between individuals and God, and we will have a wide tent that allows for both understandings. That said, things had really developed along a certain direction, along the more Protestant and less sacramentalist practice. And so I'm just going to share with you a little paragraph from one of the summaries of what Pusey did. I mean, he's a huge figure, so if you're interested in him, I'm going to encourage you to just do a little bit more reading, but here's just a taste. And this is something that intersects with us at St. James, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But it says, it talks about the church kind of having come to a practice of really not doing Eucharist except for once a year. It says, then, in the 1830s, and again, this is in the context of the Church of England. In the 1830s, several lecturers at Oxford University, reading their copies of the Book of Common Prayer, noticed that this was not the intended state of affairs, that infrequent Eucharist. The prayer book provided for a sermon at the liturgy, and by liturgy they mean the Eucharist, but not at morning prayer. For the taking of collection at the liturgy, but not at morning prayer. And in every way, it was clear that the compilers of the prayer book had intended the liturgy to be the principal service of every Sunday and feast day. So the lecturers got busy. These are other lecturers at Oxford along with Pusey. The lecturers got busy and wrote a series of pamphlets explaining this and various related points to their readers. They called the pamphlets tracts, that's Tracts, tracts for the time, by residents in Oxford. The public referred to them simply as the Oxford Tracts. The immediate result was a total washout. The majority of their readers, both clergy and laity, responded in effect by saying, yes, you have shown that the universal custom of the church from apostolic times down to the 16th century was for every Christian congregation to celebrate the Lord's Supper every Sunday. You have shown that it was the clear intent of the reformers here in England to continue this practice. And I suppose that in theory it would be a good thing if we did continue it, but, well, you know. The problem was that the Englishmen had forgotten what it was like to celebrate the liturgy every Sunday, and because they had no experience of such a thing, they simply could not imagine it actually being done. And when an occasional priest who had been convinced by the tracts to abolish the 10 o'clock morning prayer on Sunday in favor of doing a 10 o'clock liturgy or Eucharist instead, his congregation simply refused to have anything to do with it. Eventually, the leaders of the Tractarian movement, as it came to be called, saw their mistake and began advising priests as follows. Don't try to change the 10 o'clock service, leave it as morning prayer, but start another service at 8 o'clock. Make it Holy Communion. Get anyone you can to come to it, but be there every Sunday at 8 and celebrate the liturgy, even if there's only one person present beside yourselves, and then keep it up for years, all caps. And they did. Eventually, the generation of Anglicans who said, but we've never had liturgy except at Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, that's the way it's always been, was replaced by a new generation who said, every Sunday we have Holy Communion at 8 and morning prayer at 10 and evening prayer at 6. That's the way it's always been. And first, it was understood that the early service was only for the exceptionally devout, perhaps 10% of a typical congregation, but the numbers grew, and gradually the 10 o'clock service became Holy Communion on the first Sunday of each month, and the rest of the time, morning prayer. And then the first and the third Sundays of every month, and then every Sunday in Lent, and then ... It is perhaps worth mentioning that while the Tractarians were recovering for the Anglican Church the practice of celebrating the liturgy, the communion, every Sunday and every major feast day, and in larger parishes every day, other churches that had lost the practice in the 16th century were also recovering it. And the Roman Catholic Church was gradually encouraging its people to receive the Holy Communion every Sunday and more generally to be participants in the liturgy and not mere spectators. Indeed, we understand that in the Eastern Orthodox churches that the receiving of Holy Communion by the ordinary layperson every Sunday is far more common than it was a century ago. Now, that is just a very long way of saying, isn't there just such a pattern in the church? Because we had from the apostolic times all the way through to the 16th century, one evolution. Then in the 19th century, we have this reclaiming of the earlier tradition. But I can tell you that when I was a child in Detroit, Michigan, in the late 70s, I remember very vividly the day that our rector read out to the congregation, to all those present on a Sunday morning, a pastoral letter from our bishop at the time who said, "Dear people of God, because of the liturgical reform movement that is underway here, we have decided that along with the Book of Common Prayer 1979, which was the new prayer book then and is still our current prayer book, we are reclaiming the practice that aligns us with ancient practice of having the first of all, baptisms in the context of the Sunday Eucharist, or the Sunday Eucharist, which made everybody moan, truly. And then the announcement that there will be Holy Communion every Sunday. And I kid you not, the church exploded with cries of, "Oh no," and "Oh God." And this was, of course, my wonderful parents and their generation who had gotten very comfortable with the pattern of Eucharist on the first Sunday of the month and morning prayer the rest of the Sundays. And of course, it cuts the time down a little bit. And people were utterly grief-stricken at the thought of having to attend Eucharist every Sunday. And grief turned to outrage and so on and so forth. And yet it has become, over time, the accepted practice. You and I show up at St. James for Eucharist every Sunday. We have other services as well, of course, but the main Eucharist or the main service is always a Holy Eucharist. And we also at St. James have the luxury of being able to offer our Eucharist every day at 12:10. So that brings me to where I said way back when there's a connection between the Tractarians and these scholars at Oxford, the Oxford movement, and St. James Cathedral in Chicago. And that is, these tracts were being written right around the same time that St. James was being founded in 1834 here in Chicago. And over the first decades of the life of St. James, when you read our history, you'll understand that we started out a little bit more on the Protestant end, but because of the effect of the Oxford movement and because the priests who had been formed by the Oxford movement happened to take up residence in this part of the Midwest, or as it was known at the time, the West, kind of the Wild West, we have developed in a certain way, and it is in the DNA of not only St. James Cathedral, but indeed the whole Diocese of Chicago has been developed with leadership that has subscribed to the insights of the Oxford movement, including not only an emphasis on the sacrament, but including a commitment to social service, to being very much connected to the people in the street who are the most in the need. Read up on the Oxford movement, read up on its commitments, not only to sacramental life, but to concerns of justice and direct service to all those, especially those struggling and suffering the most in our midst. A lot to bite off and chew, but then Pusey is a giant figure. I hope that this gives you just enough curiosity to read up on both and to think about where in our own lives this hits, where our formation as people who value receiving the sacrament every Sunday, and also people who value more of the ethos of this movement, which is how the church is connected so directly to God's love for the world, especially those suffering the most. May God be with you this day. May God bless you and keep you this day and always. Amen.